Doubt is not evidence of faith loss, it is proof of your humanity. Welcome to episode 1 of the Ryan Holmes podcast. We exist to encourage Christian thinking and Christian living. My name is Ryan Holmes and I will be your host. I'm incredibly excited about this podcast and I'm excited to be launching with this first episode, but I'm even more excited that you chose to tune in, to check it out, to tag along. Whatever you're doing, I'm thankful that you're listening and I really appreciate it. And as we start today, I want to dive right in. And as we do that, I'm going to make an assumption about each and every one of you. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think I can say with great certainty that many, if not all of you listening, have had doubts about your Christian faith at one point or another. Some doubts may have more impact on your faith than others. Some doubts may be more significant than others, but nonetheless, I'm sure you've all had them. I think it's a good idea for us as Christians to open up this conversation about doubt. And that's what I want to do with this podcast. Open up the conversation for all those who wrestle with certain aspects of our Christian worldview. You know, this great conversation where I talk and you listen. But no, seriously, I do want to be able to connect with each and every one of you as best as I can, and there will be opportunities to do that. Not just in response to this episode, but to future episodes, to all the topics that we cover. You'll be able to email questions into me. But, you know, I certainly won't have all the answers to every last little question or objection or thought. But I'll always do my best to give you a carefully thought out response. And at the very worst, I will point you in the direction of a helpful resource for any question that you may have. Doubt is a subject that is near and dear to my heart because I've had serious doubts about my faith in the past that have even rattled my faith in the past. One thing that I think the church is doing a poor job with is helping and guiding believers through their doubts, which I think is evidenced by the alarming rate at which young people are leaving the church, especially once they graduate high school. Barna Group did a study where they asked young people the reasons why they were leaving the church, and they found that there was 6 main reasons. I'm not going to cover all 6, but I do want to highlight number 6 on the list. It was this: the church seems unfriendly to those who doubt. The church seems unfriendly to those who doubt. Here's a little bit of an excerpt from that study. Young adults with Christian experience say the church is not a place that allows them to express doubts. They do not feel safe admitting that sometimes Christianity does not make sense. In addition, many feel that the church's response to doubt is trivial. Some of the perceptions in this regard include not being able to, quote, to ask my most pressing life questions in church, unquote, and having, quote, significant intellectual doubts about my faith, unquote. In a related theme of how churches struggle to help young adults who feel marginalized, about 1 out of every 6 young adults with a Christian background said their faith does not help with depression or emotional problems they experience. Now, this was a study done in 2011, so I know it's a bit dated, but think about this for a second. Do you think that things have gotten worse or better in the past decade? It might be more anecdotal on my part, just simply based on my own observations, but I would say probably worse. This is something that I think is a great starting point, believe it or not, for this podcast. I think it might be rather ironic that my goal with this content is to encourage Christians to engage their faith in a deeper, more meaningful way, showing them that our faith is reasonable and it is evidential. And yet I'm starting this podcast with a discussion on doubt. This is a personal matter for me. Like I mentioned before, as I've had my own wrestlings with doubts. I've had to wrestle with those doubts and work through them. But when I took the personal responsibility to understand my worldview better, those doubts soon turned into greater confidence in my faith and led really to a stronger position in my faith. Serious questions that I wrestled with, I found answers to. Now, for many in the church, those questions go unanswered and it leads them down a different path, away from God and ultimately out of the church. So, with this subject of doubt and this thought, the first thing that I want to say is that doubt needs to be acknowledged. Doubt needs to be acknowledged. Obviously, first by the one who has the doubts, but also by those around them. Pastors, leaders, lay people. We as fellow believers need to meet people in those doubts and walk through them with those individuals. The worst thing that you can ever say to somebody who is wrestling with doubts or has questions is you just need to have faith. It's the worst thing that you can say. Here's the thing. I would understand saying just have faith if there weren't answers. That would make sense. But there are answers. Obviously not answers to every last little question or thought or objection that we might have. Nobody has answers that provide absolute certainty. It's just not possible. But to the most common objections or the most common questions, there are answers. And there really isn't anything new under the sun when it comes to objections or questions posed against the Christian worldview. The same kind of objections are simply repackaged and delivered in a new way. Saying just have faith is actually rather dismissive. It really can come across like you don't care enough to find answers for a struggling believer, and in general, it just shows that you don't care about their struggles. It's far easier to say just have faith than it is to carefully and lovingly walk through those doubts with a fellow believer and to actually put in the work that's needed to help them find those answers. Here's the thing. Someone is going to give them answers to their questions. Somebody's going to give them answers. Whether it's on the internet, in public school, in the university classroom, those questions are going to be answered. Now, I would say that they're getting flawed answers, but answers nonetheless. So if somebody is going to provide them with answers, why not it be the Christian who lovingly walks through those doubts with the individual with the intent on helping them find answers to their questions? I want to pause for a second and just say to those who are struggling with questions, and maybe you've been discouraged because you have been dismissed, or your questions and concerns or thoughts have been dismissed in some way, there are people out there who do desire to provide you answers to the questions that you have. So I encourage you, don't stop pursuing those answers. So the first thing that I mentioned today is that doubt needs to be acknowledged. Doubt should be acknowledged. But my second thought is that doubt is universal. Doubt is universal. Before we continue, I really appreciate you tuning in and checking this episode out, this brand new podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, please give it a 5-star rating on iTunes or whatever listening platform that you're on. And that'll help boost its reach and visibility. If you wish to financially support the podcast and the work that I'm doing, you can check out patreon.com/Ryan Holmes podcast. There are different tiered options for you to choose from, ranging from $3 a month, $5, and $10 a month. And there's different perks with each tier. If you're on YouTube, please like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date with all of our latest videos and episodes. So thank you again. I really appreciate all the support. Now, back to number 2. Doubt is universal. Doubt is inescapable. You can't avoid it. Doubt is not evidence of faith loss, it is proof of your humanity. Let me say that again. Doubt is not evidence of faith loss, it is proof of your humanity. All humans, no matter what your background is, no matter your religious worldview, all wrestle with doubts. If we think about this logically for a second, our minds are finite. This means that there are limits to our knowledge. The only way that we could ever have zero doubt would to be able to possess all knowledge or to have an infinite mind. But this would mean then we would then have to be God. So I'm sure you can see the difficulty with that. All human minds are limited, and so there will always be limits to our knowledge. It's a part of being human. Some of the greatest Christians who have ever lived wrestled with doubts. Think about John the Baptist for a second. He wrestled with doubts about Jesus. The one who was the forerunner for the Christ, the Messiah, had doubts about who the Messiah was. Let's look at Matthew chapter 11 for a second and verse number 2. This is describing John when he was in prison. The Bible says this: "Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" Jesus then went on to assuage John's doubts by giving him proof for why he was the Messiah. I think this is important to note because Jesus didn't just say, have faith. He performed miracles and gave evidence to John's followers that they could then in turn share with John so that John could have confidence in who Jesus was. How about Thomas, also known as Doubting Thomas? I bet that he never would have thought that his actions would be eventually documented in the most famous collection of books of all time and leave a lasting legacy as a doubter. But here we are, Thomas. He's the doubter. Sorry, buddy. Even someone who experienced the life of being Jesus' follower and disciple wrestled with doubts. And we know Jesus actually scolds him for his lack of faith. And it wasn't because he didn't just blindly believe that Jesus did indeed resurrect from the dead. It was because he didn't believe the testimony of the apostles regarding Jesus' resurrection. And so Jesus goes on to tell us that blessed are those who do not see and yet believe, because those who by faith are believing, those who by faith have believed are believing the eyewitness testimony of those who saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. So doubt is universal. And even those who are the most quote unquote spiritual or wise among us wrestle with doubts, whether religious or not. My final thought, is that doubt is not a reason to leave. Doubt is not a reason to leave. Simply having doubts is not a good enough reason to leave or abandon your faith. Because as we just noted, everyone wrestles with doubts, no matter who you are. If you were to abandon your faith simply on the basis of doubt, then if you were consistent, you'd be jumping from one worldview to the next or in and out of a worldview on a daily basis. And remember, demanding absolute certainty for your faith is an unrealistic expectation because as finite beings, our knowledge is limited. A lot of skeptics, they demand answers to every last question they have regarding the Christian faith, and yet they don't demand the same level of certainty when it comes to their own worldview. Almost as if unanswered questions are acceptable when it comes to their faith, but unanswered questions are unacceptable when it comes to the Christian faith. With that being said, I do believe there are far more questions that go unanswered within an atheistic framework, but we can save that for future episodes. There have been many recent stories about prominent Christian leaders or influencers who have essentially gone through this kind of faith deconstruction and have publicly announced that they've left the Christian faith. And it seems that doubts and unanswered questions they tend to be a common denominator when it comes to these faith deconstructions. And this is extremely sad and devastating, especially for those whose faith has been rattled because of these public announcements. And we should, no doubt, pray for those who have gone through this faith deconstruction and have left the faith. We should be praying for them, absolutely. But what I found interesting is one of these prominent individuals. The position that they now hold is they are a self-described hopeful agnostic. So essentially, they've gone from one position of I don't know to another position of I don't know, and yet they are confident in the insufficiency of Christianity, and they claim to be on a pursuit of truth. But they claim to not have really a grasp on truth, that they don't know, but they're confident that Christianity isn't true. You know, the only reason that an individual should leave their faith is if that faith is found to be entirely untrue. And I think that you'll find if you genuinely pursue truth and you set aside your desire for what you want to be true, the Christian worldview adequately answers the biggest questions that you and I face in this life. Questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? How did our universe come to be? How is our universe so fine-tuned for life on Earth? How did life arise from non-life? How did consciousness arise from non-consciousness? How did information arise from non-information? Where did the staggering amount of specified and complex information come from in the most primitive of life forms? Where do the laws of logic come from, or the laws of nature, or the laws of mathematics? Where did this concept of good and evil come from? And is there a remedy for evil or sin in this world that's so evident all around us? The list could go on. And I do believe that a theistic and more specifically a Christian worldview does adequately account for the big questions that you and I face. Where other worldviews, I don't believe can stand up to the same level of scrutiny. This is something I hope to unpack further with this podcast, but in the meantime, we're still on the topic of doubt. And as we wrap up, I want to try and give some practical helps or steps or tips, whatever you want to call them, if you are a believer struggling with doubt. First of all, connect with me. I know it's a shameless plug, but not because I have all the answers, because I don't, and I'm not that smart, but I hope to be able to direct you to resources that will hopefully help with whatever question you may have, and I'll do my best to provide you with answers myself. But I'd encourage you to do two things, all right? If you don't remember anything else from this podcast, you can forget what I just said. These two things, all right? Make sure you remember these two things. Number one, make sure you maintain your devotional life. And number two, do not disconnect yourself from the local church community. You see, when we go through these times of doubts or these wrestlings, we tend to stop our devotional life altogether and disconnect from the church. But if we do this, we've essentially taken one step out of the door. I want us to not think that the things that we're wrestling with are entirely intellectual or purely intellectual. We can't forget about the inner witness of the Holy Spirit in our lives, in our hearts, and God's working in our lives. And we must not forget about the benefits of the local Christian church community for encouragement, for challenge, and even for correction. So I encourage you, do not neglect these two very important things. I've wrestled greatly with doubts. And the time I spent engaging with those doubts has led to a stronger position in my faith. I do believe that doubts can lead to growth, which can lead to maturity, and can lead to bigger and bolder faith. I also believe that an untested faith isn't worth believing. An untested faith isn't worth believing. So don't fear your doubts. Don't be ashamed of them. Keep pursuing your relationship with Jesus and keep pursuing the answers to the questions that you have. Well, that's it for me today for episode 1 of the Ryan Holmes podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully this was kind of a good primer episode for you that gives you some insight into what this podcast is going to be all about. I know that this podcast is going to be nothing without you, the listener. So I really appreciate you tuning in. So thank you for that. If you have any questions for me, thoughts, comments, even topics that you might want me to cover in future episodes, please send me an email to ryanholmespodcast@gmail.com. That's ryanholmespodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to check out patreon.com/Ryan Holmes Podcast. I really appreciate any and all support. And if you're on the YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. You know what to do. And ultimately, please share this with family, with friends. If you think this is a message that needs to go out or somebody needs this, please share it with them. That's the ultimate goal of this podcast. And help me encourage others to think about their faith and live it out. So thank you and have a good week.